Hello and welcome to the Military History Club's Great Battle in 10 Minutes feature. Today I'm talking about the Battle of Inkerman that was fought between the British and the French on the one side and the Russians on the other in the Crimean Peninsula on the 5th of November 1854. 6 weeks earlier, on the 14th of September, British, French and Turkish troops had landed on the western coast of Crimea in the Tsarist Russian Empire with the intention of capturing and destroying the Russian naval port of Sevastopol. After fighting and winning the Battle of the Alma, they established themselves on a plateau to the east and south of the port, where they began digging trenches and batteries with the intention of bombarding the Russian defences. During October, the Russian field commander Prince Menshikov received substantial reinforcements and used them to attack the British supply base of Balaclava on the 25th, a clash that ended with the disastrous charge of the Light Brigade. The battle, a marginal Russian victory, left the Russians in a strong position north of the British line. In early November, Menshikov was stiffened by the arrival of two more divisions. He now had a field army of 107,000 men, compared to the Allies' 70,000, and with French engineers having pushed their siege trenches to within 200 yards of Sevastopol's defences, there was every incentive to strike sooner rather than later. His plan was to attack with 40,000 troops and 135 guns under General P.A. Dannenberg. One corps, led by General Soimenov, would sally from the suburbs. The other, under General Pavlov, would use the Inkerman Bridge to advance over the Crimea River. To oppose them, the British 2nd Division had just 3,300 troops and 12 guns. By daylight on the 5th of November, Soimenov's men had taken advantage of an absent British picket and thick mist to cross the Carenage ravine onto Shell Hill, where they sighted 22 guns. As these guns engaged the main British position on Home Ridge, 1,300 yards to the south, Soimenov's infantry continued its advance across a narrow ridge called Saddle Top Reach, driving the 2nd Division's pickets before them. With De Lacy Evans on a ship in Balaclava harbour recovering from a fall, the acting divisional commander was Major General John Pennefather, a foul-mouthed but fearless Irishman. Pennefather at once requested urgent reinforcements from the Army of Observation, and to give these troops time to arrive, he pushed forward his reserves. On their own initiative, Generals Brown and Cathcart ordered up reinforcements from their own divisions. Less helpfully, they told the French commander, General Bosquet, whom they met en route, that his assistance was not required. The first reinforcements into action were those of Brown's 88th Regiment, instructed by Pennefather to cross the Mikriakov Gully and ascend the Saddletop Ridge beyond. But a mistaken order caused the 88th to withdraw and allow the Russians to overrun 3 of the Light Division's newly arrived guns on the Mikriakov Spur. With a strong Russian column threatening to outflank the main position on Home Ridge, the danger was averted by the sudden appearance of Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Egerton and 250 men of the 77th Foot, who charged the 1,500 Russians and drove them to the foot of Shell Hill. The main Russian assault on Home Ridge also failed thanks to the heroics of the British gun battery and a charge by men of the 49th. Soimenov himself was among the dead. By now, Pavlov's corps had crossed the Chernaya and was ascending the plateau. As its vanguard emerged from the quarry ravine, it pushed a much smaller British force of the 30th Regiment back from a stone breastwork known as the main picket barrier. But the 30th quickly rallied and retook its position. Meanwhile, the left wing of Pavlov's corps, spearheaded by the Tarotine Regiment, had managed to feel its way past the British right flank, where it found and occupied an empty gun emplacement known as Sandbag Battery. It too was forced back by the timely arrival of 500 men of the 41st Regiment under Brigadier General Adams. The battle had been underway for less than an hour, and already 15,000 Russians had been repulsed by fewer than 4,000 Britons. At first, the fog had favoured the Russians, but the further they advanced, the more disorientated they became on ground more familiar to the British. However, Dannenberg still had 20,000 fresh troops, and the majority of his 135 guns were in action. The British, by contrast, were heavily outnumbered, hungry, and short of ammunition. Probing for a weakness, Dannenberg sent 10,000 troops against the British centre and right, which, not counting scattered units, was defended by just 1,400 men. Fortunately, more reinforcements were beginning to arrive, including part of the Brigade of Guards, which His Royal Highness the Duke of Cambridge himself rushed forward. But they were too late to prevent the Russians from retaking the sandbag battery and wounding Brigadier General Adams in the process. Volunteers were called for and, led by Colonel the Honourable Henry Percy and Major Sir Charles Russell of the Grenadiers, they stormed and regained the battery. It was a hollow victory. The battery faced east and, lacking a breastwork, could not be easily defended by infantry. Nor could it cover the open ground, known as the gap, between it and the right of the main British position on the ridge. The fighting at the battery continued, with the Russians several times outflanking the position and at one point even entering the left embrasure, but they were driven out and, shortly after, the garrison was reinforced by a party from the 20th Regiment. They were armed with the old brown bess, noted a British soldier, and they were able to give their fire with far greater rapidity than those armed with the Minier, which was always difficult to load rapidly. At this point, Sir George Cathcart entered the fray. Most of his 4th Division troops had been used to bolster the centre and left of Pennefather's line. Now, both Pennefather and Cambridge asked him to use 400 men from his 46th and 68th Regiments to seal the gap. Even Airey, on Raglan's behalf, sent an order for Cathcart to face north. But Cathcart had other ideas and led his men in a wild counterattack to the right of the sandbag battery, down the eastern slopes of a feature known as the Kitspur. Supported by a mixed force on the battery, Cathcart drove the Russians before him. Meanwhile, 2,000 men of the Russian Irkutsk Regiment had emerged from the Quarry Ravine, infiltrated the gap, and were now behind the British troops in the valley below. Cathcart tried vainly to remedy the situation. He immediately ordered me to get back the wings of the 20th and 68th, wrote Colonel Charles Wyndham, and tried to show front with a few skirmishers around him, and with them drove back the enemy twice. But I regret to say he was shot through the heart. The survivors scrambled back towards the sandbag battery as best they could, with Carmichael one of the few to reach safety. Cambridge, meanwhile, had fled the scene of the action with his ADC. It was the timely arrival of the French 6th Regiment that stemmed the Russian advance on the British right. Now it was the turn of the British centre to come under pressure. At around 8:30 a.m, the Russians gained a foothold on Home Ridge, capturing 3 British guns in the process. They were quickly retaken by 60 French Zouaves, who had marched to the battlefield on their own initiative. But in leading the successful charge, Sir George Brown was wounded in the arm and had to be evacuated. Still, the Russians made ground. They advanced masked by fire from the 90 guns on Shell Hill. And all the while, the British commander, Lord Raglan, who had arrived on the scene at 7 a.m, was content to let Pennefather direct the fighting. It was now that the remnants of the 30th and 55th Regiments were forced back from the centre of Home Ridge by a strong Russian column. All that stood between the Russians and the 2nd Division's camp was the second of the 2 French regiments that Bosquet had sent forward. Fortunately, supported by Colonel Egerton and the remnants of the 77th, they drove back the Russians with dreadful slaughter. Further to the right, 600 men of the 21st and 63rd Regiments pushed a separate Russian column back down the post road and past the barrier. On the Home Ridge, meanwhile, 2 18-pounders that Raglan had requested 2 hours earlier finally appeared. One by one, the lighter Russian guns on Shell Hill were put out of action or forced to move ground. At 10 a.m, Bosquet arrived with 2,000 extra troops and 12 heavy guns. The guns helped the British 18-pounders tilt the battle even further in the Allies' favour, but the troops were wasted as Bosquet unwisely led them forward to a position beyond the gap that was exposed on both flanks. The Russians duly emerged from the ravines on either side, forcing a hurried retreat and almost capturing Bosquet. Yet again, the sandbag battery changed hands. Bosquet counterattacked with 2 battalions of Zouaves and Algerians, accompanied by a handful of British troops, and together they recaptured the battery. It was now 11 a.m, and, having ebbed and flowed all morning, the battle was no longer in the balance. The Allies had around 13,000 troops in the field. Dannenberg had more, but only 14,000 fit for battle. His chief priority was to extricate his troops and artillery back across the Crimea before they suffered even more casualties. By early afternoon, the Russians had withdrawn across the river. Their losses were crippling: 10,700 killed, wounded, and captured. The British had lost almost 600 killed and 1,860 wounded. The French, 13 killed and 750 wounded. So concentrated was the carnage at the sandbag battery that Bosquet dubbed it l'abattoir. Raglan was later criticised for not taking a firmer grip on the battle, but such was the nature of the terrain, not to mention the foggy weather, that all overall direction was impossible. Hundreds of isolated actions were fought that day, over rock-strewn ravines and brush-covered slopes, by small groups of officers and men. It was thanks to their individual courage and stubbornness that the Allies won the day. Even in victory, the outlook was bleak, so shattered were the British regiments that an early assault on Sevastopol was out of the question. It would have to wait for the arrival of fresh troops, munitions and supplies, and that was unlikely before the new year. In the meantime, lacking shelter and cold weather equipment, the Allies would be subjected to the full force of a Crimean winter. Thank you.